Welcome to Modern Dogma, a Christian considering today's ideas. Let's try to think through modern monetary theory, or MMT, from a biblical perspective. MMT is a very unique, innovative economic framework that challenges the current consensus economic perspective that is typically called neo-Keynesianism. Now, we're not going to worry about every facet of neo-Keynesianism, but the critical idea you need to grab a hold of today is the fact that the current consensus belief is that government spending is funded by collecting taxes from its citizens and or borrowing money via the issuance of some kind of what's known as government debt securities. Basically, IOUs the government issues where they borrow money from someone. So we're going to talk about this from an American perspective. So these debt securities would typically be called what we call U.S. Treasuries. But anyway, as you probably learned in your civics class in high school, these U.S. Treasuries are what the American government issues when they have a budget deficit, which is basically all of the time, but they want to spend anyway on military, entitlements, education, or whatever, and the taxes they receive from the people aren't enough, so they give these IOUs to whoever buys these U.S. Treasury securities, and then the nation has a loan so that they can spend money on whatever federal programs and initiatives they need to spend money on. Now, that's very intuitive, and let me be clear up front. This is what I still believe is true, and I'm going to try to argue some implications from the Bible to prove my point. I believe taxes are real treasures that we owe to the government. It's actual money we're giving to the government that represents real purchasing power. And I think what Congress wants to spend money on is genuinely being driven by either tax revenue or increasing debt through borrowing via the issuance of treasuries. This is the intuitive, simple, consensus way to think about government spending, right? Money goes into the government through taxes or borrowing, and then spending goes out to fund Medicare or to build a new bridge or whatever. Now, the brilliance of MMT, and I say brilliance in a neutral way, not because I agree with it. It really is a very innovative and creative way to think, and I'll explain in a second. But I actually find MMT a very beautifully cynical theory in some respects that I find very intellectually attractive. But the interesting proposition posed by MMT is that we all have the relationship between taxation and government spending backwards. We literally all have it flipped. And in fact, it's more fundamental than that. What MMT proposes is inverting the story of how money is created. Now, before we get to how money is created today, according to the Orthodox and the MMT perspectives, let me give a very fast overview of how we think money developed through history. And I'm going to skip a few intermediary steps, by the way, just to keep things fast. But a long time ago, before we have these abstracted things called paper money, people would exchange real goods and services with each other, bartering, in other words. When you have a bunch of grain and someone had a bunch of cattle and you need some of the cattle, you'd exchange a bunch of wheat and you'd get a roughly fair amount of cattle back. But that's very difficult to do because you have to keep lugging around all this wheat and animals. Maybe one of your cows died on the way to the trade, or it was tough to figure out exactly how to convert so-and-so stalks of grain into such and such number of chickens or whatever. It's a very crude, clunky way to trade. So people had the ingenious idea to slowly start facilitating these financial and economic transactions through some kind of representative artifact, something that represents the real goods and services and takes its place so that we don't have to lug around the actual stuff, something that represents how much buying power, how much transacting power you have, how much wealth, in other words. But you know what? There's another problem. That all sounds fine and good. Let's not haul around cows and chickens anymore. Great, that sounds awesome. But how can I trust that whatever we're going to use in its place to represent cows and chickens and real stuff is actually going to hold value in the marketplace? So let's skip some steps here, and therein lies the value proposition of government-stamped gold and silver coins. You see, the power of government-backed gold and silver currency is twofold. Number one, God invented governments and imbued them with a derivative of his sovereign authority. This is Romans 13, verse 1. Quote, be subject to the governing authorities, end quote. And we discussed the God-ordained power of government in episodes 16 and 17, our relation to government. God gave rulers authority and told them their job was to uphold righteousness and punish evildoers. And you can also state a government's job is to uphold the societal fabric of a nation. And part of upholding the fabric of a nation is to provide the framework for effective trade. And that includes being the issuer of currency. So government-backed currency is great because it plays off of the fact that God invented governments and by the word of his command imbued government with authority. So the reason why government-backed and government-issued currency is so effective is for this divine fact. The second reason government-backed gold and silver currency is great is the material, gold and silver. And in episode 18, the theology of gold, there's a second surprisingly theological reason here government-backed gold and silver currency is so effective. So the first theological support comes from the government part. The second theological support is the gold and silver. Gold and silver have what's known as intrinsic value. It is valuable in and of itself. It's real treasure. And that is really borne out, especially today, because gold and silver currency no longer even exists. Nobody uses gold and silver coins to facilitate trade. And yet, they have still retained its value as real, valuable treasure. That is an enormous testament to how theological gold and silver are. Gold and silver are valuable simply because God said so. That's the ultimate foundational reason. So again, listen to episode 18 on the theology of gold if you want more details. But that's the second phase of money. You started with the commodities themselves being the medium of exchange, chickens and wheat and cows. And the next phase here, government-backed gold and silver currency. Now, as great as it was to just need to carry around gold coins, people also got tired of that. Gold and silver are heavy. It's not easily transportable. So people innovated, as they always do, as they are made in the image of a creative God. People innovated and found a way to make money even easier to carry and even easier to transact with. And also a way to grow the supply of money to accommodate the rapid rise of technologies and innovations that were demanding more and more capital to fund. Now, if you're what's called a gold bug, in other words, if you idolize gold, just like the Bitcoin maximalists like Michael Saylor idolized Bitcoin, you think this jump from gold currency into this next phase called fiat currency, paper money issued by a government's pure fiat or decree, was a great sin against humanity that opened the floodgates of government profligacy and all the shenanigans of what's known as deficit spending. So, a couple quick thoughts on this point I can't help but offer. First of all, I do think there's truth to the notion that people, even scaled up to the governmental national level, have a sinful propensity to want to spend more than they can afford. And this desire to overspend probably did, in part, fuel this shift away from what gold bugs called hard money, gold-backed money, into paper money. However, in that same breath, I'd offer a couple points from the other side to balance that perspective because I think it's way too simplistic to say we moved away from gold and silver coins purely due to sinful greed. First, I think apropos is the idiom, to a hammer every problem is a nail, and to finance nerds, every problem in the world is monetary. We talked in episode 15, the theology of Bitcoin, how at the height of the Bitcoin mania, these Gnostic Bitcoin cultists were unsarcastically, dead seriously using the phrase, Bitcoin solves this, and throwing it at literally every problem known to man. Literally, world hunger, Bitcoin solves this. Human sadness, Bitcoin solves this. Wars, Bitcoin solves this. I am not exaggerating, by the way. People actually thought this. Folks, the root problem of the world is not monetary. And it doesn't matter if your money of choice is Bitcoin or gold or whatever. The world's problem is not the type of money it's using. That is utter foolishness borne out by someone getting tunnel visioned due to their one economic and financial specialization. We know from God's words, the actual root problem with the world is rebellion against God. It's sin. It's man's broken, corrupted heart. Wars, poverty, overspending, the constant desire for more existed in every phase of money. Commodity money, gold currency, and paper currency today. Sin was always there. Forcibly returning to some earlier phase of money will not suddenly turn the world into a utopia. So, was there some sin motive entwined in the world's gradual shift from gold-backed money to fiat money? Yeah, probably. Sin is so entrenched into every facet of human existence. If you audit any human enterprise with enough detail, you're going to find sin. I have no doubt about that. I'm a good Calvinist. I believe in the totality of depravity. That is to say, every part of human nature, and I'd extend that to every activity coming out of humanity, will have some degree of staining by sin. There is nothing pure coming out of human beings. But the type of money we use is the least of our problems. Don't get caught up into the world's obsession with money. The world worships money. This is why Jesus emphasizes the dangers of loving money so much. Money is the world's master, the world's idol. And idolatry of money isn't always expressed as someone who's always really greedy and wants to hoard lots of money. Idolatry is also a matter of what is occupying your thought life the most. What do you think about constantly? What do you always mentally reach for as a solution to the world's and your own personal problems? Gold bugs and Bitcoin maxis alike have a worldview that obsesses over the currency used by the globe, and my pushback is they're woefully missing the point. Sin is the problem, and faith in God is the solution. Everything else that went wrong after sin, maybe the type of money we use is a manifestation of sin. But don't get the story backwards. If we're using the wrong type of money as a nation, that will get solved after we deal with the primary root problem of sin. And beyond that, the second less important response I would give to the gold bug, hard money types like Peter Schiff is they need to understand that there were also morally neutral, rational reasons why currency continued to abstract away from hard, real stuff like wheat and then gold and silver into the fiat paper money we have today. And that's because there was a need for a rapid expansion of the supply of money to accommodate the rapid exponential increase of human innovations and technological advancements. People were starting businesses, in other words, and they needed funding for new inventions and industries. And having your money supply hard fixed to some finite amount, like Bitcoin cultists claim is an advantage of Bitcoin, or even something like gold, where the supply grows so slowly because you need to literally mine it out of the ground. It makes money too scarce to keep up with all these inventive, creative people that were rapidly creating new innovations. So what I'm trying to say is that whereas it's probably true money became abstracted partly due to man's sin nature that wants to spend more than he makes out of greed and recklessness, there was also mixed in there a very real need for the rapid increase of money for perfectly valid reasons, namely to create technology. And I would actually argue that the vast majority of the reason money became abstracted was actually for morally neutral purposes. I mean, the hard money folks need to really think about what they're asking for. Do you really want to revert to a world with gold-backed currency? Now, will you ensure governments will never overspend that way? Sure, that's probably true. But what you're also asking for is a giant leap backwards in national prosperity. And I have a hard time believing anyone, if they had to choose between their family and friends and neighbors suffering from a period of severe economic depression, where the trade-off is, will maybe ensure the government keeps your debt in check, will choose to go back to a gold standard. I have a very, very difficult time believing anyone that states they'll make that choice. We live in a fallen world full of internal contradictions, unfortunate trade-offs, and imperfect decisions. We live in a world that is always gradually decaying. This is why Jesus has to come back and restore all things. This is why we need a new earth. And when it comes to monetary systems in this fallen world, money supply wants to organically grow, many times through a phase shift in the type of money into a more abstracted form. And the result is more people have clean running water. More people have automobiles to get to work and they don't have to keep walking for hours. We get indoor plumbing, insulated houses, we grow more food. And the unfortunate side effect is governments also lose more and more restraints on their spending. You become vulnerable to price inflations. In certain times and places, you even get hyperinflations. When you have abstract money, it's easier for countries to abuse it and cause real financial havoc. It's an imperfect decision, but I truly believe the abstraction of money away from hard money has also provided the benefit of sustaining countless lives. Gold bugs are overly negative on paper money, in my opinion, without seriously considering the benefits it also reaped. But we're getting a little bit off track here. The main point is, the historical overview of money's development is we started off bartering goods and services with each other. That got clunky, so we started using money, and we started using more and more abstracted money because it was easier to facilitate trade. And now we have paper currency today, issued and backed by government fiat alone. No real backing to a hard asset like gold or anything. And in my estimation, that lack of backing to gold is both a bad and good thing, and honestly, not that important relative to the real problem of sin inside every man's heart in the world today. Okay, now, returning to MMT. Something very important to note about our historical overview of money is, notice, where does money originate from in each phase? Where does the wealth come from? It comes from individual people, right? It's individual people that produce valuable stuff. And then money is just an abstraction that represents that productive individual's purchasing power, right? It's the individual citizen that made a bunch of real valuable stuff, and money is effectively created based on that. So then, let's bring the government into focus now. What is the government's relationship to all the individual people that live in the country that all have individual measures of wealth represented by money? The government exists to ensure everyone is trading their wealth back and forth with each other in a fair way and enforcing the standardized kind of currency everyone should use so that transactions go smoothly and nobody is constantly paranoid about being cheated by someone using fake coins or whatever. And further, where does the government get its money from? From the people. People make stuff, people make wealth, and then people give a bit of their wealth back, a bit of their money back to the government via taxation, and that's how the government has money that it can then use to do stuff that you need collective centralized power to do, stuff like building roads and funding an army, because selfish individual people aren't going to want to fund that stuff voluntarily, unlike what libertarians would love for us all to believe. But money originates with individual people, and then government gets money from the people through taxes. Now, here is the really creative part of MMT. What MMT proposes is that may be true all the way up to and including when money was backed by a real thing like gold, but once money evolved into fiat currency, and further, once a national government has control over the ability to print that fiat currency, MMT advocates propose you can do something very clever where you flip the origin of money. In other words, money is no longer created at the level of individual people looking for ways to trade goods and services with each other in a smooth way. Rather, money can, and in fact is, actually created at the high government level. The government creates money out of thin air, and this is for the purpose of stimulating economic activity and getting people to do productive and helpful things. In fact, according to MMT, when the government is getting taxes from people, It's not that people are providing the government funding, which in turn the government spends in order to fund public projects. Rather, what is actually occurring is the government makes money, gives it to people, like a dad giving an allowance to his kids. The kids go and spend their newfound wealth and hopefully do productive society benefiting things with it. And then the government effectively puts a gun to the head of the kid and demands the money back. Now, why the government puts a gun to the kid and demands the money back via taxation, according to MMT, is because that is how governments ensure their paper currency has value. So the widely recognized father of MMT, Warren Mosler, describes it this way, and I'm going to adapt his analogy a little bit. But imagine I, as a father, tried to pay my kids to do household benefiting productive chores with my business cards. How would the kids react? Not very enthused. None of my kids want my worthless business cards because they're just dumb pieces of paper. But now imagine I stated, you owe me 10 business cards by the end of the day, or else you're getting a punishment. Suddenly, by pure fiat, my previously worthless paper business cards become super valuable. Suddenly, the kids are going to do whatever they need to do to get business cards. And not just any business cards, my business cards. They are going to do a ton of chores like crazy. And the motive is to avoid punishment. So bringing it back to a national economy, the motive here is not to go to jail for evasion of paying taxes. That's what makes US dollars and other paper currencies valuable. There is looming at the base level an implicit threat that if you don't have enough of those paper dollars, as worthless as you may believe they are intrinsically, you're in a heap of trouble. So at the end of the day, governments that control their own monetary printing press, whether they realize it or not, never have a real spending limit. Any appeals to balanced budgets or fiscal responsibility is a total ruse. Governments do not receive money from people that they in turn spend. Governments don't really go into quote-unquote debt. Money is something that originates with government itself, and they can print as much of it as they need to fund whatever programs or initiatives they deem important, and the only real spending limit is when you bump up against the ceiling of real economic resources. So the simplified idea here is as governments print and spend more and more money, you gradually maximize the use of your economy's real stuff, namely laborers and natural resources and the like. But up until that point, the more you spend, the better. More people feel rich, which leads to hiring more workers, which means less unemployment, which leads to people buying more stuff, which leads to the maximum amount of your resource production capacity being used and not just lying dormant doing nothing. But then, once you spend too much, all those resources get used up. Everyone that wants a job has a job. All your natural resources are getting used up to make stuff. And that's when you finally have too much money floating around, and that shows up as price inflation. At this point, MMT advocates like Stephanie Kelton would state, you hit the money printing constraint of real resources, and you need to reduce the money supply through things like taxation. So that's the real point of taxes in the MMT world. Taxes aren't how governments get funded. Taxes are a tool used by government to precisely control the amount of money floating around. Governments don't need money. It's actually backwards. Governments control money. They make it and they destroy it in order to finely tune the speed of the economy. Now, one of the key startling implications of MMT, if you've been tracking with me up to this point, is that a nation's debt is not actually inherently bad. That is a very, very key concept to MMT. National debt is not necessarily bad. In fact, this is such a critical concept to MMT that MMT economist Stephanie Kelton felt compelled to title her magnum opus, The Deficit Myth. Apparently, Kelton believed the heart of MMT was this bold claim that debt is not always bad. And if you accept the assumptions of MMT, the logic has a sense to it. Think about it. If the government is the creator of currency, how can a deficit ever really occur? In fact, all a government's deficit measures is how much money it created and handed out to its citizens to make them richer. As Stephanie Kelton puts it in The Deficit Myth, the government's deficit is nothing more than the citizens' surplus. It's just a number that tracks how much abstracted wealth, scare quotes, the government is creating out of thin air and handing out to people. A government that can print its own currency doesn't owe anyone anything. It just owes it to itself, if anything. A government can never go insolvent. So the MMT advocate concludes, whereas debt is a dangerous problem for an individual or a household or even for a nation when it was using earlier forms of money like gold-backed money, if you are talking about a nation today that has control over its own currency printing press, like the United States or Great Britain or Japan, debts are not only no longer inherently dangerous, they can actually be quite good. And this is why Stephanie Kelton would even go so far as to say that there's a correlation between nations carrying large debts and prosperity. National debt can be very good as it's simply a tracker of wealth creation. Now, how do I respond as a Christian? I propose there are two ways to conceptualize MMT, and they are as follows. On the one hand, MMT can be taken as a mere description of the current state of our modern monetary system. And to that end, I actually find MMT pretty undeniable and actually a brilliantly cynical take on modern politics and our government. Western politicians, generation after generation, make such a big deal about how they are borrowing from their children's future and how unsustainable deficits are and how politicians on the other side of the aisle are responsible for all sorts of reckless spending, and that's the real reason. Financial reasons are the real reasons why we can't pass this bill in the House. Definitely not just political saber rattling, yada, yada, yada. We're in one of them right now with this whole, government shutdown debate. And I find MMT such a funny and clever commentary on how modern-day politicians all play this game where they pretend to care about deficits, when at the end of the day, clearly no one does. When Republican President George W. Bush came into power and enjoyed a solidly Republican Congress, I remember many conservatives, they later became known as the Tea Party Republicans, remember them? Expressing outrage over the insane deficit spending that was being committed by a president that was supposed to be a professing fiscal conservative. Someone that was supposed to come from a party that stands for fiscal responsibility and austere budgeting. And of course, the Democrats piled on and complained, but then you get Democrats in power, and if they have a solid left-wing legislature, the same thing happens. They spend money like there's no tomorrow. Our deficit never decreases except for little blips of surplus every once in a while. It only ever goes up. And what I find hilarious about MMT as a descriptive theory is how it almost sarcastically embraces the charade and says, yeah, you know what? Not only does no one in the government actually care about deficits, deficits are actually good. I mean, that kind of thinking reminds me strongly of one of my favorite books, Catch-22. That kind of flipping the script and pushing little societal absurdities to its maximum. I gotta say, that really tickles my funny bone. I love that kind of stuff. Let's just go all the way and flip the world upside down. Why go on pretending like debt is bad? Words are cheap. Let's just be honest and own up to what we actually believe. Debt is righteous. Debt is good. Debt is fun. Sour is sweet, black is white, night is day. Debt is wealth. And I find this bizarre circus hall of mirrors world painted by MMT hard to deny. In our current monetary evolution of fiat currency, especially when that currency is controlled by a sovereign nation, how can you deny that's not exactly what we're doing? How can you deny the government effectively just makes whatever amount of money it wants out of nothing? Like some cheap imitation of God in Genesis 1, and then pretends like it's funded by taxes and treasuries. It's obviously all just a shell game, and MMT formalizes it into economic theory, and I find the whole thing so funny. The global monetary regime is a giant game of musical chairs. Everyone knows we don't have enough chairs. Everyone knows the United States can never make good on its IOUs, which amounts to, at the time of this recording, $1.5 trillion. But we're in a situation where as long as you have continual cash flow, as long as the music keeps playing, we all just pretend we don't see that there's a chair missing. So as a cynical description of how the monetary system works today in our paper currency era, I'm actually a huge fan of MMT. It is an accurate description of the insane state of our monetary system today. The problem is, a lot of folks, especially on the political left in the United States, takes MMT as a descriptive theory and turns it into prescription, thinking MMT stands for magical money tree. They think they have found the secret to cold fusion, creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. They go beyond MMT as a cynical, funny take on how backwards our monetary system is as a game of unsustainable musical chairs, and actually believe we need to lean into MMT and make policy with it because we have found the secret to finally bringing in utopia. Oh my gosh, just print money. Why didn't we think of it before? We're so brilliant now. We've evolved through the entire history of the world into this new perfect monetary form. We've solved it, gang. We invented fiat paper currency. We've arrived at enlightenment. Just churn out USDs like crazy, and we found a magical way to fund every single utopian project you can think of. A universal federal jobs guarantee program. Not a single person will ever be poor again. Universal healthcare with no limits because printing money for sure is the same thing as real medical goods and services, right? But I have several disagreements with MMT as a Christian, if you couldn't tell from how sarcastic I was being. But for today, we're going to cover my first criticism, building on the framework we developed 2 episodes ago, episode 27, where we discussed the concept of general and particulars, system and constituents from a biblical framework. So you may want to go back and listen to that episode because I won't be laying out the theoretical foundation again here. But if you recall, one of the important conclusions we came to in episode 27 is that the Bible appears to imply that morality and goodness in its essential forms do not change even as you scale up from the constituent individual level up to the big systemic level of a whole nation. So, for example, murder is sin for an individual that commits it. Thou shalt not murder, the 6th commandment in the Old Covenant law in Exodus 20, and carried over under the law of Christ in the New Covenant. Well, just because you put a lot of individual people together, numbering the millions, to the point where those huge group of individual people can be called a nation, does not suddenly make murder permissible. Even at the national level, even at the largest scale, the systemic group general level, murder is still murder. Morality doesn't change. This is why people feel compelled to make things like the Geneva Conventions that are supposed to define transnationally, at the national system level, what is and is not considered murder. So even when killing each other in war, nations believe there is a difference between fair combat and murdering in cold blood. Nations have this law of God inside of them, this conscience that tells them we have to abide by certain moral rules when we interact with each other as nations. Now, I'm being strongly tempted to go off into a huge tangent here about whether or not these nation-transcending laws like the Geneva Conventions are even effective and why they aren't theologically, but I'll do my best to restrain myself. My only point right now is to point out we human beings felt compelled to write things like the Geneva Conventions because we know, even beyond the level of individuals, nations must not commit murder against other nations. The immorality of murder does not change just because you're at a larger scale. Then how about theft? Individuals cannot steal, theft is sin, but then does stealing somehow become more nuanced or even permissible when you scale up from the individual to the national level? No, theft is always sin. Governments cannot steal. This is exactly what the evil king Ahab in 1 Kings chapter 21 was condemned for by God when Ahab abused the power of the state to falsely condemn a man named Naboth in order to steal his land. And this was also the central point of the argument in Judges 11 between Jephthah and the Ammonites, who were falsely claiming the nation of Israel stole territory. Even at the nation against nation level, everyone understood stealing was still sin. This is why Jephthah goes through great pains in Judges 11 to trace through the history of Israel's territory and establish that the land Israel occupied did not rightfully belong to the Ammonites, but was in fact legitimately taken from the evil Amorites who, unprovoked, aggressively attacked Israel, subsequently lost, and then God gave their land over to Israel. So we established that biblical evidence shows morality and goodness do not change across scales. And this means the danger of unresolvable debt to an individual must also remain consistently dangerous even when scaled up to a nation. Now, I say danger and not sin, unlike the examples of murder and theft, because debt is a little trickier. Is it considered sin to borrow money or be in debt? The Bible does not expressly say so, so we should be careful to not say so either. But rather, the Bible warns of the danger of debt and how being in debt can become sin if it is not paid back in a timely manner, as it states in Psalm 37:21, where King David writes, quote, "The wicked borrows but does not pay back," end quote. It becomes theft at that point, effectively. But just like the act of taking out a loan, this is more a matter of wisdom. Is this a calculated risk you're taking, as life often requires, or is it a reckless, foolish decision? And this is also why I generalized in stating we're talking about matters of both morality and goodness and its consistency across scales. We're not only talking about things that are a matter of righteousness and evil, but also matters of wisdom and foolishness, goodness and badness, for lack of better terms. And debt is not a good thing. It's not necessarily sin, though it can certainly become sin when pressed to its extremes and taken on recklessly, but it's never good. It could be necessary at times, but debts are something that is like a wound. It needs to be healed. It's a hole in a fabric that needs to be mended. And that's true for an individual, a whole household, a whole county or state, or even a whole national government. The Bible goes so far as to warn in Proverbs 22, verse 7, that when you are a borrower, you are effectively enslaved to your lender. You now enter his world, operating on his terms. There is something fundamentally deficient about you now, financially, that you need to seek to restore as fast as possible. Debt can become very, very dangerous very, very quickly, particularly when the debt grows to such a magnitude that it becomes unresolvably large. In fact, the danger of large debts is such a fundamental concept in God's universe that it is actually the entire basis for the gospel message. You see, the broken relationship man has with his Creator can be described myriad ways. In Romans 5, verse 10, the Bible describes men as enemies of God, opposing him and seeking to undermine his will. Isaiah chapter 44, verses 17 to 20, describes men as stupidly worshiping blind, dumb, and deaf idols in the place of worshiping the true God. We're idolaters. But another biblical analogy used by the Holy Spirit to describe our sad natural state is the language of being in debt to God. In Matthew chapter 18, starting with verse 21, Jesus is asked by his disciple Peter, quote, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" End quote. And Peter thought this was quite a generous number. 7 times. Imagine someone committing the same sin against you month after month. We would think in our natural fleshly state that forgiving someone 7 times is quite generous. And yet Jesus, in typical Jesus-like fashion, gives a surprising answer. God rarely responds the way we think he would. Jesus responds, quote, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times," end quote. In other words, you never stop forgiving. And to provide the moral rationale for why it is so imperative for us sinners to repeatedly forgive our fellow neighbors that sin against us, Jesus provides Peter a parable. Starting with verse 23, quote, "Therefore, The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold, his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." End quote. This was an enormous sum of money owed by the servant, 10,000 talents. In fact, one talent was worth about 20 years' wages for a typical laborer in Jesus' day. So, doing the multiplication, this man would need to work 200,000 years to pay off his debt. Truth be told, it was an absurd statement to make. Just give me time, I'll pay back everything. It was clearly an impossibly large sum to pay back. It was never going to happen. Talk about a crushing weight of debt. But then see what this generous and gracious master does in verse 27. Quote, "And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt." End quote. By being in sin, we human beings owe an enormous, unpayable, astronomically large spiritual debt to our Creator God. And this debt of sin was so large, it required a God-sized check to pay it off in the form of God the Son coming down, becoming fully man, fully God, building up spiritual wealth through living a perfectly righteous life, and then freely giving his wealth to pay off the debt of undeserving sinners by dying on the cross. Jesus' life and death, the whole gospel, can be framed in financial terms as it is here in Matthew 18. And the financial analogy of the gospel begins with the premise that large debts are dangerous. They are inherently bad. A great analogy is a physical vacuum. A vacuum does not stay void in the physical world. Something needs to rush in and fill that empty space. That is how financial debts are on this earth. Somebody has to take care of the cost when there is an existing debt. It doesn't go away, and it is certainly not good. And notice, this truth is at the largest scale possible. This is a spiritual, divine, entire universe encompassing level truth. Debt is dangerous. Debt is wrong. Perpetual large spiritual debts that have no way of being repaid is a wound in the fabric of the universe that the triune Godhead thought was such a problem that Jesus had to come down and heal it by laying down his own life. So, if large debts are dangerous at the highest spiritual scale, it must follow that when you decompose down to the lower national scale, large national debts must also be considered dangerous. The essentials of morality and goodness and truth principles don't change across scales. Let's grab the stick from the other end to check our work. Scaling up. We know large debts are problematic at the individual level. If you are being crushed right now with a huge credit card bill, you understand inherently how dangerous debts are. Well, you scale up from your individual life back up to the national level. Again, large debts must be consistently dangerous across every scale, across every corner of the universe, in every facet of human existence. And we know this with a high degree of confidence. Why? Because the Word of God reaches for the intuitive understanding of a financial debt's danger when describing the spiritual problem of man. To say a deficit can somehow be a good thing in some specialized corner of the monetary system just because you control the paper money printer cannot make sense. And therefore, I think I can confidently say MMT as a prescription, not as a mere cynical description of the as-is reality, but MMT as a prescription cannot be correct. Embracing the power of a money printer cannot be the solution to making a nation strong and prosperous. And so my first rebuttal today is MMT is wrong because large national debts can never be neutral or good. Debt is always dangerous across every scale, including nations. Now, again, MMT is a cynical description, totally accurate, hilariously correct. The government is 100% just effectively making money out of thin air every year and just feigning interest in a balanced budget. That is absolutely how the system works today. I don't know how anyone can deny it. Congress is not getting funded by taxes and these puny treasury securities. There is no way the U.S. is going to pay down the $1.5 trillion deficit. Nobody seriously thinks that's going to happen. And yet, all these huge federal programs always magically find funding every year. Why? Is the government seriously just sitting around waiting for tax receipts to come in and then going, okay, phew, good, now we can fund Social Security? No, they just spend it. They spend the money first from nothing. It's totally MMT. But policy prescribers using MMT get it wrong at this point when they call this reality good. They embrace it and think that's normal, sustainable behavior for a nation. It's not. It's how the system works today. It's what we're doing. But it's not a good thing that should be embraced. It's an unsustainable, unresolvable financial wound that will matter eventually. Debt is inherently dangerous to a nation. The danger may not realize immediately or even imminently, but history bears us out time and time again. We'll go into a few more rebuttals why MMT is unbiblical in our next episodes, but for now, thank you for tuning in to Modern Dogma. You can follow Modern Dogma on Instagram at Modern Dogma or Twitter at Modern_Dogma. And please consider leaving us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Men err, God is sovereign.